it's Valentine's Day. Usually we do like a little Valentine's fun thing together, but since it's the first meeting, we decided to make it a little more like, what do we love? Well, we love filmmaking and visual effects. So Nico, we were talking a couple weeks ago and he was like, oh, have you seen this docuseries on Disney Plus about ILM? I'm like, no, I don't have Disney Plus. And then he wouldn't stop talking about it. I'm like, well, let's do a meeting. And so then Sam's like, well, I worked on it. So we have people here to talk about a project that is very in line with what our group is made for. So I will let Nico and Sam take it from here. If you want to do a quick introduce and then let me know when to screen share for you.
Sure. I am Nico Johnson. Like Shana said, I was kind of back with the original crew when we started this whole kind of get together. And since then, I've become a bit of a conform and visual effects artist at Harbor Picture Company with Ben Grube and Sam. And just before I started working there, Sam was working actually on this project, coloring it and kind of getting it finalized before it shipped out to the world. And I just kind of happened to come across it because this is my realm as well. So I was super passionate about some of the topics and has some good information. I think that anyone who likes these topics, I think would really get a lot out of and a lot of insight. So happy to share what I find passion in with you guys to see if it resonates.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm Sam. I recognize, I think, most of the names here. Yeah, so like Nico said, I also work with Nico and Ben, and I kind of had a pretty heavy hand in this documentary series. I am credited as associate colorist on the series, but I probably did 90% of the actual color grading on this show, as well as a good chunk of the conform work. So I'm pretty familiar with the entire thing. And yeah, excited to talk about it and answer questions and get into it.
For sure.
Oh, and my title at Harbor is senior color assist.
Yeah, there you go.
Doesn't get any higher than that.
Oh, it gets a little higher, I think.
Senior.
It gets shorter. Yeah. It gets shorter but higher.
Shorter but higher, exactly.
You remove words.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, so maybe just to give a little overview of the series first. It's a 6-part series on Disney about sort of the creation and upcoming of ILM, which is Industrial Light and Magic, which is one of the biggest visual effects companies out there, and how sort of George Lucas founded the company and how he found the people that actually came together and sort of created all of these sort of revolutionary visual effects that had never been seen before for the first Star Wars, and then it sort of grew from there.
Yeah, it's very much it ignites and starts with Star Wars, and then it really just starts to run away because they manifested their skill set in a lot of different ways. I click. Hey, all right. So here's the trailer. Just like Sam said, this is like a docuseries that covers a lot of topics, so it kind of puts it on there.
Visual effects create the magic that makes people want to go to the movies. Movies are special effects. We start with an empty frame. Anything is possible.
As audiences see through the illusion that are just phrases.
How do we do this now? How do we make this look great? I leave it to the geniuses at ILM.
It's right there in the name, Industrial Light and Magic.
The history of ILM goes way back. When I was writing Star Wars, there were no special effects houses in the world. So how are we going to do the effects? I realized that I was going to have to start a company.
We didn't really know what we were doing. We were not movie people. George wanted a bunch of guys who didn't know what was impossible.
We were departing from convention. We had to build equipment from scratch. This was a long shot. You make it look like a professional movie instead of a bunch of kids having fun. We realized nothing is impossible. There was just something here about people. Suddenly, everybody wants to come to ILM.
We were trying to do things that have never been done before.
Oh, man, I'm making this up as I go.
They're pushing technology forward.
There's so many innovations that ILM made. Digital editing, computer graphics. We developed Pixar to be a cartoon company. One thing led to another. We turned into Photoshop. Now you could manipulate images.
Visual effects would never be the same again. I remember that incredible feeling when all you've got is an idea. It was so exciting.
I want to work with people that inspire me. That is the spirit of ILM. It goes back to that original group that were unpretentious, brilliant people.
That was our family. We enjoyed each other's company.
Yes, we water slided. Yes, we were immature, but nobody worked harder. We were the Rebel Alliance.
Ooh. Yes, that's the overview.
It's basically a 6-part advertisement for ILM and Disney.
Yeah, it's a lot of advertising, but if you like the movies and stuff, it's pretty cool.
It is also cool at the same time.
Exactly. But with a big company like this, like we said, where they started off as kind of a small problem solvers for what Star Wars was, the huge shot list and the amount of things that they just had no idea how to do. That was kind of the inception of this group, and it's kind of just a group of misfits, which I think is the title of the first episode. It's like just a group of misfits group of outsiders, where everyone kind of has their really devout and technical skill set. However, they're not all in one place. They all kind of came from different walks of life, engineering and all different kinds of mechanical backgrounds rather than a digital one. And you'll see that kind of manifest through how they've problem solved in the beginning. Nope. Oh, that worked. All right, so here's just a couple stills from some of their early movies, as well as different types of effects that they kind of tackled at different parts of their career. Just kind of CG characters, CG elements like the feather, full-on compositing and doing motion control systems, as well as just matte paintings and green screen. Roto compositing. This is just that breakdown. Here's some more. Here's some kind of different new references and homages to some of their original character work and their initial, CG environments and characters they built, as well as kind of different evolutions of that, where it started as exterior and got to more, character-driven, performance-based captures. And so at this point, I would turn to just talking about the larger evolution of technique that kind of exhibited that I saw throughout the piece. And I'm going to need to reference my notes just to see, but in general, there's just a lot of different aspects of every single realm. But I guess to be specific, we could say started as stop motion and a lot of puppeteering with people like Phil Tippett, who's this guy up here on the left. And I kind of saw, at least organize these images in a way where we kind of talk about the initial production and principal photography phase of, puppeting a character in a scene, and then compositing it using originally film scans and physically pushing them together through one scanner to then composite them, starting at the evolution of someone hand drawing matte paintings. And the names are actually escaping me, but it's Harrison Ellishaw and Ken Ralston, a couple other guys that were involved. And how this kind of evolved from this old style of painting and a lot of references to older styles to Joe Johnston, the bottom right here, who kind of introduced the techniques that translated to the digital era, where it was much more about like the sheets of glass and layering rather than large canvas paintings. And then just here's another example where instead of doing a CG environment, they physically built large swaths of the Death Star so that they could practically film it with a motion capture rig. And one of the largest evolutions in technique that I think is present throughout the series is, if I click, their motion control system, which we don't have to get into specifics here unless anyone's interested, but they started very mechanically and with an engineering mindset to figure out how they could easily replicate and organize their movements for all the different shot work that they had planned. Sam, you can weigh in here if you'd like, but I remember there's something like crazy thousands of shots they're trying to pull off, and they just had no idea for the first like several months of production. They couldn't even figure out how they were going to do it. So that's like probably one of the first sections of the first and second episode was them going over how they just figured out what they were going to do, and how they devised it. Which I have more pictures here as well, kind of it in action in different uses. So this kind of shows off a couple of different ways they manipulated the camera over top of sets, through sets, you know, from a distance like regular kind of production, and on tracks, which they a lot of times through this, yes, it is on Disney Plus, I think. And just to elaborate on this bottom right picture a little bit, there was a shot, I think in Empire Strikes Back, where a tauntaun runs across the ice. I think it's like the opening shot over a mountainscape. They go over it in detail, you know, but just to show an example of evolution between the first and second Star Wars, they really had to come at it from a perspective of how are we going to tackle these shots in a linear fashion, you know, starting with nothing. How do we build something that can do X? How can we build something that can do Y? And how do we put this all together? The tauntaun happened the other way around. So it was one of the first times, you know, a fix it and post kind of mindset was applied to something that they normally would have approached up front. So they wanted to have a tauntaun running across the ice. They already had the plate of it happening, and then tried to figure out how to reverse engineer and basically develop a new style of doing that. And that was just another kind of way they pushed this part of the motion capture system for the camera. Any questions, topics, interesting, boring?
Can you just like what is the advantage of like a motion control rig, if you want to like lay that out in like layperson's terms?
For sure, yeah. So a motion control system is a way to manipulate, in this case it was the camera, but it could be any sort of object, prop, character in a manipulatable and repeatable way. So it allows for, you know, a stage performance, if you will, of whatever your character is. So if you're having the Millennium Falcon fly across the screen from left to right, you want to be able to replicate the movement so that you could, for instance, do multiple passes with, you know, one shot of the Millennium Falcon, one shot of the things chasing the Millennium Falcon, and then putting that all together. So having the control to be able to do it again without having the elements at play at the same time was a huge advantage in production, because it'll enabled you to really break out the assets as you needed based on what was called for in the script.
Totally.
Yeah, and the camera was definitely, I think, like one of the most like astonishing things to see how much went into, you know, pulling it off. Like it's just thousands of like wires and cables and machines pushing together just to make one little thing look, you know, repeatable, which by today's standards probably wouldn't even be passable in some instances, because it was very mechanical and clicky, versus, you know, today where you want that like easy ease on everything to make it look right.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, let's try the next one.
I think that camera system has a name of Dijkstraflex, which was named after John Dykstra, the original VFX SUP of ILM and Star Wars.
Yeah, he is on our Mount Rushmore VFX for this series as well. But yeah, John Dykstra is a huge name. I would say he's like one of the cooler guys, but also one of like the sadder stories in the series, because in addition to all like the wonder and, you know, challenges they overcame as a team, they definitely faced a lot of politics, and there's a lot of things going on between like George Lucas, the production company, the studio, and the VFX houses. So his story was a little more of a somber ending. There we go. So here's a couple different references to some of their early storyboarding techniques. You know, I think the origins for all this are very painterly and artistic in the sense, to me, rather than like a comic book approach versus something that I would do myself. So it was cool to see how they evolved. The top two are actually Phantom Menace, and then lower is Empire Strikes Back. So it's kind of going in reverse order, but the idea was they kind of really nailed down the pre-production, pre-visualization process for something that involved this many assets, this many shots, and this many revisions. I feel like they really started to hit their stride, as well as understanding what they could control given their new workflows. I don't want to click too many times if it's gonna jump. There you go. Cool. So here's some more pictures. Again, just some early shots of George Lucas and his team. This is Rose. I can never say her last name. Duignan. She's another one of our Mount Rushmore VFX people. We'll talk about her in a second.
We'll see the Mount Rushmore in a second here.
Yeah, exactly. But either way, the point is this was just like an early pre-production get together where they were reviewing all the hundreds and thousands of shots and assets that they needed, and then figuring out how to break them out, how to shoot them as independent elements rather than all together, and have control over, say, changing something later, even if it's something like they had to shoot one way over another. Yeah, the X sheet on the wall. Yeah, good call, Brett. Oh yeah, and the chess set. I see someone mentioning something about this. This is a super cool little story in the series as well, because they cover how George really wanted this to be like kind of a much larger piece than it was in the film, but they didn't have the technology to kind of pull off all of these crazy creatures and everything all at once with the timeline they had. So they ended up turning to Phil Tippett to kind of really bring all of these characters and creatures to life. And yeah, that's another really good one. Really good example of that. All right, here's a few more later developments of some, I would almost call them less of storyboards and more of concept art at times, but then they actually turned into some of the reference images as well, if you've seen the films. And if you remember, just this shot in particular was a important one in the series as well, because they went over how they shot it, specifically because of the physical limitations of having such a large motion control system and camera, where you physically couldn't get a camera this close to it to do the Starfighter. So instead they flipped it upside down and devised a different way to approach it. So here's another breakdown of how they would go about shooting something, for instance, where you have a Star Destroyer, the Millennium Falcon, and a bunch of things chasing. You would usually shoot each of these as their own passes, develop matte for each of them, and then be able to composite all together into one shot. And even though this isn't referring to this shot, this is the same kind of approach and how they would practically shoot each of these elements with a camera that's repeated, doing the same move with a viewing monitor, same as we would have nowadays, and just doing it over and over again and then compositing it until it works. Is there any questions or things to mention with this? I see, I'm trying to read the chat too as we go here.
Could you describe this process a little more in detail?
Sure.
Yeah, the analog compositing stuff still confuses me a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's also a great reason to check this doc out, because they go over all like how they did it. You know, like for a lot of things nowadays, we can just take it for granted because it's just a quick button or a shortcut. But you know, there's a lot of art and passion that goes into some of these maneuvers. So, for instance, in this shot where you have the Millennium Falcon being chased with a background destroyer and everything's probably moving independently, in order to kind of make it feasible, you know, rather than having one person animate or one control system animating each of the ships by themselves, by only dealing with one of them at a time, you're able to really finesse and make sure what you're getting with each of the layers is correct. So after you would shoot each of the layers, they would look like the top left and bottom left images, where they would be, you know, on blue or on green, whatever. And honestly, I would love to hear if anyone has any insight as to how they would go about physically extracting the mats, because that is something I'm not super familiar with. However, once they would have these mats like on the bottom right, you know, just overlaying them and using like a blend mode or just the film outline, I think would give you the cutout, or they were physically cutting out film strips if that was the only option. But once you have all those assets separated, putting them together, you know, into like a Starfield background and letting the film run is, you know, a completed shot.
I think the early keying was done photochemically. I'm not sure, but I think they actually were able to get transparent portions depending on the color exposed with a certain photochemical process. I know that's, I think, Superman, one of the first instances of that being used. But yeah, ultimately, all these are just literally like sandwiched together, right? Like where they're prints that are like optically printed, sandwiched together physically, which we do now digitally. It's cool.
Exactly. And I think a lot of that, it's kind of like a difference of vinyl versus like MP3 or something. You know, you get the texture and you get the imperfections and all the things that make, you know, an optically composited film look the way it does. So a lot of what George Lucas was saying actually about, like, I think I want to say it was at the end of the film, but he was saying that then the doc, he was saying like he wasn't happy with a lot of the themes and that it was imperfect. There's a lot of problems that he himself didn't like, but it's something that, you know, for me as someone that loves like the process that went behind this and kind of the journey rather than the destination of the film, I think there's a lot of love to appreciate with that. But I guess in today's world, I also see why you'd want that to be perfect if you're like imagining it one way and seeing tape lines. That was the other thing, is they use a lot of clear tape to just put stuff together. So if you really were looking at this thing, especially with a denoised copy of the film, you're probably gonna be able to see it, which kind of showed up, I think, as well in some of the scans.
And I think part of it too is that for every shot that's considered an optical shot, you know, it has to be kind of reprinted, because it's, you know, taking one piece of film or multiple pieces of film and kind of creating a new piece of, you know, a new print out of those pieces of film. So the end result is essentially a copy, which is inherently going to be worse quality than the original photography. So every shot that has an effect kind of like that is sort of degraded in some way, because it has all those effects happening. And I think they talk about this in the doc, but I think they talk about using the VistaVision format, which I think is like a physically larger piece of film, which is maybe, I think, gives them more flexibility to do these effects or something like that. I forget exactly what they said in the doc, but I think that was one of the drawbacks, which they kind of had to work around.
Exactly, yeah. And I think all of this, you know, with the nuance, just kind of goes to show you that no matter what you're doing, whatever project you're working on, there's always going to be things and obstacles to overcome and to work around. However, predicting them and seeing them before they happen, I think really informs the process, especially when you get to see how they approach like Star Wars 1 versus Star Wars 2. It was like totally different, and they had a much better game plan that paid off in strides in some ways, but also they had new challenges. And Zach, I think so there might have been some rear projection in use, especially at least in Star Wars 1, where we're at the dock. But for like large scale sets like this, some of this was like actually painted. Some of this was, you know, just like poster boards they threw up, and some of it was keyed. So I think it's a total mix by Avery. And I think that's also another really good key to take away, is that every shot you do, no matter what it is, you can always approach it a different way to make it easier, to make it cheaper, to make it more feasible, whatever you need to do. Even from the beginning of, you know, Star Wars, they were thinking about that. Go to the next guy. Just here's a few more shots I found that were kind of elaborating on that process of going from like a storyboarding or visualizing from a script to the actual principal shoot. You know, just from the assets like the Seeker to that shot I mentioned earlier, where they actually filmed it practically upside down like this to allow the lens to get like millimeters off of the bottom of the base, which, you know, was not a crazy tactic strategy to have for a shot like this back in the day. But if you had shown someone, you know, back in the 70s or 80s, a shot where the camera's physically closer than you could hold it, you know, how would you come up with that idea? So it's just cool to see that as well to me. So we've got some history, very nice. All right, our Mount Rushmore VFX. If any of you guys know these names, lovely to hear. But it's John Knoll. Actually, sorry, these are what they look like in the doc and when they were young. John Dykstra's bottom left, and here they are when they're fully older with some names.
Fully older. I love
fully
it.
older. Yeah. So these are all basically, I would consider everyone in this documentary series is a pioneer of this field, but these four people, I think for me, had the most lasting impact, especially in my particular interest. So, you know, I definitely see someone putting Phil Tippett or a couple other names in here, but these for me were the most important, or at least the most impactful. And like I mentioned earlier, Patricia Rose Duignan, how would you say that?
Dignan?
Dignan? I like Dignan. All right. So she was, I believe, to start a secretary or an assistant to George Lucas, and was basically brought in to help him just kind of like manage the chaos of the shot tracking and the processes of when they were like getting all the assets. So she kind of devised a methodology for it and got everyone in shape and got it to a place where it was like repeatable and actually feasible. So once she did that, it kind of proved, it shows in the doc how that had such a lasting impact, and it made the entire team much more efficient to be able to pull off the vast amount of shots they were trying to pull off in such a short amount of time. Dennis Murin, again, they all have a lot of accomplishments, but the highlights for me that are jumping off, Dennis Murin kind of headed the CG and computer departments as they kind of formed. And that's really a whole another section of this docuseries that's really fascinating, is transition from the mechanical and the analog world to the digital one. So, you know, a lot of people were kind of cut out of the process by, you know, coming from an analog world and being unable to transition, as well as a lot of new faces came in that weren't connected to the original group. So I think the company as a whole went through a huge restructure and kind of they morphed into something larger and kind of more intellectual, rather than just something that was like, George Lucas has movie needs this, they do this.
Good use of
And
morph.
John, sorry?
Good use of morph.
Yeah, they talk about how they created morphing too. That comes up later. John Dykstra was the original guy that kind of like got handed the VFX baton for Star Wars 1, assembled the team, led the team, got kind of left in the dust a bit, but I think gave the blueprint for how you would assemble a team based on, you know, what you actually need to do versus what you're being asked to do. And then John Knoll was a little bit later of a person that shows him in the documentary, but he's one of the founding members of Photoshop, as well as, you know, really, I think, took not just the transition to digital by storm, but like pushed it into an evolved state where he brought 2D compositing into the mix, and it leveled up everything from there, because then he got involved with like the prequel Star Wars movies, which are a lot more technically challenging. But yeah, so that's Mount Rushmore. Anyone ever hear these guys, or have anyone else they think absolutely should be on this or something like that?
Well, I think, isn't Dennis Muren's hand the one that's controlling the asteroid worm on what is it, Empire Strikes Back?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, he's
pretty
like
sure.
Out of the miniature set, like he's the one controlling it. But yeah, so I love how much like practical stuff, just seeing, I haven't seen the series yet, but just seeing behind the scenes stuff like forever, how much of it is just clever practical solutions that really work well. Like the speeder that they showed too, where it's just a mirror underneath it. Like, so it just reflects the environment, but it sells the shot. It's like, it's really cool.
I know, it's crazy how these are some of the most intelligent people you'd ever see, and they've come up with some of like the simplest or like stupidest ideas that are like brilliant. You're like, oh my god, like how did you get that shot? Oh, I just turned the whole thing upside down and shot it really close. It's like, oh, all right, yeah. Like, why didn't I even think of that? So yeah, I really enjoy learning about these guys and seeing how they kind of problem solve, because a lot of this documentary is a group of problem solvers that are misfits, but are also just dealing with challenges as they come. You know, there's never a moment, and constantly throughout the documentary series, you'll hear them say like, oh yeah, there was this one thing where we didn't really know how to do this. So I went to the guys in the model shop and I asked them how they would do it. And they said this, you know, and then just showing how that ping-ponging process in a collaborative environment just breeds solutions and breeds, you know, cheap ways of doing something that maybe is a small compromise creatively, but when your heads are in the right place and you have the goal in mind, I think anything is really achievable. So I think that's a place of inspiration and feels like a sense of home to be like, yeah, like you exist in the unknown, but you just have to find your way through it.
I found out how to pronounce her last name, by the way, Patricia's last name. Dugnan.
What's that? Dugnan. We're close.
Dugnan. It's close. I leaned on one of the vowels and I picked wrong.
Yeah. I originally was gonna make a Mount Rushmore and then a like unsung heroes, which I still have a slide for, but I was gonna put Rose at the top of that, but I was like, she did it. Like, she's the reason why the movie came out and was like on schedule and all that. So she's for sure in that process. And then Dennis and John and everyone that just kind of resonate for me. All right, next one. Let's see. Yeah, here's that unsung heroes one. This is just like a picture after they transitioned from analog to digital, I believe. So you could really just see like the scale of the team went from maybe, let's just say 5 departments with, you know, 10 people in it to literally hundreds, because they had to grow their computer department, their engineering department, everything, just everything. And a lot of physical arts went by the wayside, but they still kept enough around, like Phil Tippett and a couple of his team. So in addition to checking out, this was from the IMDb. I just kind of wanted to put all the names in one spot so you can kind of see a lot of guys. I think it's also really interesting how a lot of the guys that were talking throughout this were in the camera department, because, you know, even though they don't have any visual effects or CG kind of backgrounds, they were instrumental in forming the shots and being involved with the creative decisions between George, John Dykstra and whoever the other creative was, if it wasn't George Lucas on the project. So I in their own way, they are their own directors, they are their own artists, and I think they all should be recognized and seen as such. But yeah, so that's them. Here's just a couple more stills of here was one of the shots, and then this isn't the same model, but just goes to show you how they would create the same asset at different scales and work with them however they needed to get the shot.
Yeah, I mean, Jacob earlier brought up Weta as like a pioneer, and Eric chiming in about the late 90s that really revolutionized, but getting back to that whole idea of like integrated across art department, where you have model fabricators, prop designers, all working with the same creative team. And I think Weta got kind of back to that magic, like secret sauce of early ILM, and part of their big reason for revolutionizing.
That's a good point. All right, so more on that kind of VFX pre-pro and shot tracking conversation I brought up with Rose. This on the back wall behind this guy is her system, or the system that they settled on for, I think, the second or third Star Wars movie, where it was really just like a strip with basically a checkbox for every single type of asset they would need. It's like, oh, this needs a matte, this needs a clone, this needs like all the different things. They would literally just handwrite them all out and then just track them on these thousands of shots on the wall. So just it goes to make you appreciate collecting data like that, data like this, that's camera report data, that's really essential for VFX purposes and CG. And now we just kind of get it, at least for the shot tracking stuff, we get it in shot grid, which was shotgun. So just kind of shows how we started this really messy system that has evolved into quite a easy and painless way, usually, by comparison. And so the digital revolution was probably the biggest shift in the doc, as well as like in the company, because I think they went from, like Brad was just mentioning, the secret sauce of kind of having this camaraderie that was breeding something new versus bringing in a lot of new people, cutting out the people that couldn't transition and all that. So the transition to CG was a huge section as well, and this is just a couple stills to kind of show some of what was going on at that time, where they go over kind of how they came up with the system for generating RGB values at pixel. The top left image here, they showed how they came up with the concept for I believe it was like a chalice or like some sort of cup at first, and then the first real example of this was the stained glass knight. I forget what it's from, but it was a classical.
Yeah. Young Sherlock Holmes. Young Sherlock Holmes.
There you go. Yeah. So that was I think one of the first CG shots they really went in depth in the doc, just to kind of show all that went into it. But then they also talked about the limitations with it being a hard surface character that was, he was fighting with someone. Basically, he had like a sword fight with the character. It was a stained glass figurine without any kind of metal connecting it. So it was perfect for CG because it was really low poly count, and they could just rely on their character animators. And then just a couple other pictures here. You can see how big some of the machines were at first in the computer room, as well as the early kind of renditions of the Abyss test. At a couple points throughout the doc, they also have a lot of directors coming in and talking about different projects that came up, and specifically for the Abyss, this was a test just to kind of show James Cameron that, like, hey, we're not in the analog world anymore. We can do this in CG. Here's a test of what water could look like moving. And I remember Jim saying, like, it wasn't convincing by any means, but it definitely showed, like, if it works, like, nothing's gonna be impossible anymore. And then just moving on, obviously Jurassic Park was the ultimate kind of the ultimate way this kind of manifested at the very end of it. But there was also really early attempts at kind of character scanning, where they would try to project a scan of a human or a character onto like a mock geo of that, and they got away with a lot, particularly with, in Terminator 2, that was kind of how they pulled off the melting through bar scene and a couple other things where it's kind of a cheap trick, but they did it very expensively up front, and it paid off on the effect. Here was the Jurassic Park kind of origins, where they this for sure, if anyone's into CG, should be a topic you look at, because it was basically they like didn't want to do it in CG. They wanted to do it practically with puppets and Phil Tippett, and they wanted to build it all out how they used to do things. But as the kind of project kept chugging along in the background, the CG guys started like tinkering and realized like we could do this, like we could pull off a test. And eventually, after they kind of did it in their free time a while, people heard about it and they realized that, yeah, this could work. And the bottom left picture was actually the screening of the test of it. So this is the first like CG test that everyone saw on the big screen with like the big executives and everyone. And once they saw this, I think is a point in time, like even though we weren't alive and everything, it's a shift in, VFX as a whole, where I think a room of people realize that once like this is now what we're going to be doing. This isn't the final result, but this is how we're going to be doing it, because to get to this point before, it was, years of work just to get to something that was kind of close. Yeah. All right. And that leads us to Sam's section to talk about some of the film scans that we worked on at Harbor for this project.
Yeah, hey guys. So I was just gonna go through a few examples of kind of different kinds of media that we had to work with for this doc, because there were so many different kinds of formats. Some of them sort of presented different kinds of challenges on how to grade that material. And so if I switch over to me relinquish control from Nico. Oh, there we go. Here, I'll switch over to Resolve. I'm basically using this as PowerPoint. And I basically have, hide that. You guys can still see, right?
Not any pop-ups or popping up menus.
Can you see Resolve?
Yeah, I can see Resolve.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
But nothing up close, right?
Okay. All right, so basically there were several different kinds of sort of sources that were a part of making this documentary. And I kind of was just going to run through a few of them. So kind of the main format that was present here were the interviews, which was, I think, shot on Sony Venice. So it was kind of the cleanest and the nicest looking of all the formats in this doc. So, they had obviously very nice lenses and it was all beautifully lit and it made for very nice material to grade. And so these are just some of the interview shots that we had to work with. I think they kind of assembled sort of sets and backgrounds for each of these people, sort of dependent on what they did in a way, a little bit. Like I think George Lucas is more like in his wider shot, it's a little bit more of like an office-y kind of setting. And for George Dykstra here, it's a little bit of like a stage, kind of behind the stage or something like that. So all of these had sort of different elements, and for all of these, we tweaked the lighting and we made sure that the actual person looked their very best. And yeah, so these were sort of the interview formats, but this was the kind of the top tier format that we had, and everything else was sort of a lot worse than this. So there were a few other kinds of formats that we had. I'll just go from the bottom here. We had a lot of stuff that was shot on tape, different kinds of things that just looked kind of like garbage. And there were several times when we're going through a watch down of this, and we have to try to sharpen something or sort of bring back a little bit of detail. Like you can see sort of in his shirt here, there's stuff that's clipped. This is a very small example of it, but plenty of times when stuff gets clipped, or there's like a weird sort of like purple or green hue that's on the edge of everything, and it's like sometimes it's too strong and you have to kind of pull it back. And so pretty much all of every B-roll shot that is of this sort of crummy material, compared to the interviews, it has some sort of effect, whether it's a softening of some like harsh edges or reining in some weird colors. All of these shots have something going on like that, on top of just sort of the overall balance and the overall color grade and the overall look that's being applied to it. Another one, this was sort of one of the bigger ones, was these Star Wars scans that we got. These were scans from print of Star Wars that actually hadn't been used ever before, and they were kind of crappy looking. So it was a little bit up to us to sort of come up with the best sort of way to quote unquote restore the film. It was basically really, really full of a lot of scratches and a lot of green. You can actually see one of the scratches up here. So I spent a lot of time going through and doing a little bit of dust busting, as well as figuring out exactly how we should sort of reduce kind of the excessive grain to make it look, as nice as you're seeing it here. That's kind of as nice as we could get it. And they were sort of exploring, do we do sort of noise reduction as part of the color grade? Do we have another sort of vendor try to do their best to sort of work their magic and make it look as good as possible? And they settled on what we were able to come up with in the color grade. And it's kind of hard to show in a really low resolution compressed screenshot here, but I promise you that the original source was a lot darker, a lot crummier looking, and when you brightened it up, it sort of revealed all of these artifacts. So it was very cool to see these scans and everything, but it was a bit of a challenge to get it in decent looking shape. And in the doc, they used them for a couple of different scenes, mostly this sort of snowy scene on, I think it's Hoth is this planet in Star Wars, and then on here when they're racing on the speeders. And this is actually a very cool scene. They're talking about how they sort of figured out how to shoot this scene. They basically had models and everything, and they kind of did a test shoot I think I might have a screenshot somewhere of it, but they basically had a tiny little like tape camera that they ran through following the mini model speeder as kind of a proof of concept. And then they sort of, that was successful, and they then obviously did it in real life with some plates and everything like that. Throughout not film, but series, there's a ton of sort of behind the scenes stuff that they shot on either 8mm or 16mm film. And a lot of this stuff was actually the nicest looking material of all of this B-roll. Some of it aged really, really well, and it was really, really pleasing with, everything was sort of decently exposed, and sort of looked pretty great. And actually an interesting thing that they were kind of going back and forth on in the grade was whether to leave these sort of soft edges on the corners exposed, or whether they should kind of crop them in to sort of make all of the borders of these shots sort of clean. And on most of it, you can see they left some of that in to kind of keep it authentic. You can see a little bit of a sprocket down here. So they ended up leaving some of that in, but they were going back and forth pretty much the entire time, which was fun. But yeah, so this stuff, you have some really good looking B-roll of, this is Phil Tippett here doing one of the monsters. Yeah, so this stuff is really cool to grade. And then there's some shots from actual movies where, these were a little bit more all over the place. Some of them, they had a really high quality transfer from a Blu-ray or something, but some, like there's a shot in the very beginning, which is from Titanic, where it's like the most compressed shot of Titanic you could possibly get. And we had flagged it during like the first color session, and it was never replaced. So there's just a crappy compressed Titanic shot that's in the episode, and it looks terrible compared to a lot of the other stuff, but what are you gonna do? So yeah, there's rips from some of the sources as well were actually the HDR copies, which I thought was interesting. So we had to take the HDR master sort of and transfer it into our sort of common working space, and then back out to whatever other version we were making. So we had stuff from 2001 from Indiana Jones, and then there was some stuff like, I think this is a VHS copy of New Hope. I'm not sure, but you can see that it's pretty crummy looking, and there's a lot of stuff that's like blown out, and yeah, it doesn't look great. So there was a lot of saving some of the material as well.
Sam, I think I know the answer to this, but Jacob asked, did you use ACES?
We did not use ACES. No, we although it is a very common workflow. We sort of use our own color pipeline, but the sort of main function of ASIS still applies in our pipeline, where you're working in what's called a scene referred workflow, where you basically take whatever color space or format the source is in and sort of transfer it into, everything gets converted into one common space. And then all of the grading and operation happens in that one space. And then, your output space is whatever your destination is, whether that's Rec 709 for streaming or whatever, or an HDR thing or theatrical, whatever it is. The same concept still applies. And then there were a lot of graphics and sort of animations in this show as well. So anytime that, they cut to something like this, where they sort of have this drawing or like this one, which we saw before, which was the motion control, all of these graphics, these were all created by a graphics vendor and then delivered to us. And sometimes they looked great and sometimes they did not look as great. And they had a lot of notes on the titles, these yellow titles I'll talk about that next, but these graphics sort of had a big variety of quality. You can see that there's kind of this sort of paper texture on these graphics, and on some of them it's a bit heavier than others, and they weren't thrilled with kind of how, I guess, gritty or dirty this paper was. So they had me sort of manipulate these graphics to be more or less yellow or more or less dirty, and sort of clean them up when they probably could have communicated some of that to the graphics vendor, but they stuck it with me instead. So that was cool. And yeah, like just cutting between these two, like these are both, quote unquote graphics on paper, but they obviously have a very different visual aesthetic. One is super bright and has a vignette and everything, and the other is a much more flat. So yeah, there was a big mix. Another thing were these yellow subtitles, which are kind of throughout the whole thing. And they wanted this very, very specific Star Wars yellow. And when you're working, when you're working with Dolby Vision, because of the way the pipeline has to work with Dolby Vision, the titles basically have to, or the titles and any sort of overlay that goes on top of the footage has to go through basically a separate transform. I'm trying to simplify it a lot here, but basically a separate transform from the rest of the footage. And since most graphics and titles and everything are created in Rec 709, as it goes through that HDR pipeline, it's not sort of checked as to how that transfer from SDR to HDR and back is going to manipulate the color of whatever your graphic is. So for these very specific orange subtitles, the color was getting thrown all out of whack, and it was a gigantic rabbit hole that we had to go down to figure out how to make sure that these titles remained a very specific kind of orange throughout the whole pipeline, which was not fun. But we obviously got it because they're looking pretty Star Wars orange here. These are just a couple other graphics that came from those graphics vendors, and you can see there's a big kind of mix of sort of how, sort of the aesthetic of these graphics. Like some have this giant blur vignette, some have a regular vignette to just darken the edges, and some I believe, I don't know if it's this one, but there's another one which I may have a screenshot of, where it's sort of like this yearbook sort of picture, but they actually manufactured the whole thing. So they created a paper graphic and like took pictures and added, kind of made it look like a yearbook in a way, if they didn't have exactly what they needed. So they kind of took a little bit of creative license on some of these things. And then there's this stuff which is sort of, supposed to look like you're shooting a computer monitor. And so we had to play with the vignette on this, and how bright do we want John Knoll's name and Thomas Knoll's name and everything. So there was a lot of time spent on manipulating these graphics. Oh yeah, and here's another section of all these storyboards, which also had kind of their own treatment. And these were a little bit more just kind of straight scans of the actual storyboards. Like you can find copies of these storyboards online, and they look pretty much just like this. But we spent a lot of time cleaning up sort of these dirty edges and some of the grit, and like these scripts, cleaning up all these stains and everything, just to make it look more or less dirty, depending on, oh yeah, here's that kind of yearbook thing. This image is totally manufactured, and they actually spelled a couple names wrong, so they had to go back and, you know, submit a revision for that. And then there's also, you know, in the later episodes, they get into sort of the future and the current state of visual effects, and a lot of this stuff is actual digital cameras, which produces a much cleaner image compared to some of the other stuff. This is just some BTS of when they were shooting Mandalorian and, you know, other people here, but it's obviously a much cleaner image with a digital sensor. So this was a much simpler shot to grade all of these things in the later episodes. I think that's sort of it. That's all I kind of wanted to go over. I don't know if anybody has any questions about the grade or any sort of the finishing process. That's kind of what I was most involved in.
I'm curious, is the color alone and then some like vignetting and then cleaning up, are these all potentially separate areas, or are you kind of generally doing any of this touch-up grading stuff yourself?
It was kind of all on me. So the DI sort of covered a lot of that territory, where we were in charge of not just making things look acceptable and nice, but also doing a bit of that cleanup. So, you know, whether it was removing like a bunch of grain, or I don't know, sometimes it's a little bit of, you know, it borders on visual effects territory. So, you know, it could be like reducing, you know, the eye bags under somebody's eyes or something like that. You know, we do a lot of those sorts of things, or like changing the color of something in the background if it was meant to be a different color, things like that. So all of those things can sort of fall on the color grade. And so things like cleaning up the graphics and, you know, sort of manipulating all of these things to make them look as good as possible. You know, they could have gone back to the graphics vendor who actually created this thing and said, we want these paper graphics to be less dirty, but that would require, you know, more rounds of revisions and probably more expensive. So they're already having someone go through and color grade. You know, we had the capability of attempting and succeeding in this case to do those things as part of the color grade. So we were able to just do it here. But, you know, sometimes you know, whatever the ask is, it's a little bit beyond the scope of the color grade. And so, you know, you kind of have to kick it to a visual effects person or vendor or whoever it is.
Okay. Also, I'm curious, when you're making something this long, are you trying to keep all these different types of media across the whole thing consistent, at least within each type of media, or are things like is it like at certain times, regardless of which type of media it is, colors change, or is it like the whole thing, regardless of the media, you're trying to keep like, you know, skin tones in a certain area and certain color quality similar? Like when you're doing something this long, you want to speak on that at all?
Yeah, that's a bit of part of the challenge. You know, when the process sort of started, one of the first things that was done was we went through all of the interviews and sort of set hero looks for each of our interviewees. And so that was done in one of the first episodes, and then we basically, you know, that was sort of locked. And so then as we went through the other episodes, we sort of had these sort of keystone images to sort of go back to. So we know for a fact that George Lucas in episode 5 is going to look the same that he looked in episode 1. And so part of the challenge was keep making sure that they stayed the same throughout their own interview, but also that, you know, each of these interviews, when cutting back and forth from one another, you know, they all kind of generally look like they're living in the same world. So, you know, Joe Johnston's face is not so much brighter than, you know, Richard Edlund's face here, and they all kind of look like they're a part of the same world. but that being said, like these interviews were several hours long. So if they're cutting, so say this shot of George Lucas was, they shot this while the sun was at point A in the sky. And then, 3 hours later, the sun's at a different point. The lighting, both on him and also in the background, looks different. So we sort of had to balance, balance those two times of the interview and making sure that those, if they were cutting together, they have to look the same. So we had to make sure that the interview itself was balanced throughout the whole series, and then also cutting around the interviews and in between and out of B-roll, and different kinds of graphics and everything, that everything kind of cut smooth and was consistent. And then, for sort of some of the film elements, it's a similar sort of concept where it all sort of had to look like it was part of the same world. Obviously there are some things that are going to look different, like, this shot on the set of Indiana Jones is going to have different lighting and different colors and everything like that compared to like a meeting here. But in terms of sort of luminance and contrast, like everything has to sort of cut nicely together and feel like it's part of the same project. So you are basically throughout the entire show kind of double checking and going back on yourself and, redoing things and making sure that it all is kind of living together nicely. So yeah, a lot of that, a lot of the job is sort of second guessing yourself and redoing things and kind of noodling forever and ever and finding it's hard to settle exactly on, oh, maybe this shot should be like 1% brighter, or like the black level needs to be 1% down to cut nicely with whatever it's cutting against, kind of thing. So yeah, it's a bit of a process.
Yeah, and I think the important thing that you're kind of hitting on, Jacob, is the delineation between conform and color, or effects and color, and conform, keeping your edits separate from your color work, separate from your visual effects and visual changes, because like you just kind of insinuated, like it easily was crossing into Sam's territory where, bring up his face. Well, it's a moving shot with things going in front and behind, that instantly becomes a visual effect shot that he would bump up to someone else. But I think what you're also bringing up is the difference between like an independent approach to filmmaking versus a commercial workflow. So for us, this is a commercial workflow where we have a lot of the media, we have a lot of the formatting, there's a lot of preparation that goes into setting these up and understanding how that they're going to look. And then as another thing you were referencing was putting all of these languages, all these formats into one cohesive thing that can always look the same and then is by human touch controlled and maintained to be consistent and balanced. So establishing your project output, master format is kind of the guide for us in the commercial workflow, where, we know we're going to have tens of different formats, but ultimately we know we're going to need a 3040 by 2160 deliverable at whatever ratio at, all the different specs. So getting all of your information when you can and preparing for it to execute throughout something as long as this or as short as a personal project is very important. And it's exhibited on this project for sure.
Yeah, totally. Excellent points. Another sort of curveball with this, maybe not necessarily curveball, but part of the sort of setting the look is that our hero format for this job was HDR. So that was the pass that we did first. So there was a whole, there's a whole conversation that has to be had when grading in HDR about, how bright do you really want your highlights to go? More often than not, most of the image is within that sort of 100 nit SDR range. But it's really, if I go to one of the interview shots here, for example, like these lights behind John Dykstra here. I know that in HDR, these lights were really, really bright, and we could have cranked these lights so that they are 1,000 nits and sear your eyes out every time we cut to a shot of him. But it's part of the artistic part of the HDR to sort of control how bright those highlights are actually going to go. And so that was another sort of piece of it, was figuring out how bright we want the HDR version, and then once creating the SDR version after that, sort of figuring out how to best translate those bright highlights down to the world of SDR with that 100 nit cap. So that was another part of sort of figuring out that process from the very beginning.
That's really cool. Thanks for the info. I might message you on Slack or something because I have a ton of questions about this. But I have a Valentine's Day dinner I have to go to. So
All right. Sounds good. In the interest of just wrapping up, Sam, you want to jump back to the
See you, Jacob.
right.
See you, Jared.
Sorry, jump back to the what?
The project, the presentation.
Oh, yeah.
There's only like 1 or 2 slides. I just want to wrap up. These are just 2 quotes that I really thought about when I first heard them, was to elevating the technology to be able to understand George's vision, or to understand vision. I think that's a guiding principle in visual effects and post as a whole. You know, we always want to elevate the technology to achieve a vision rather than coming up with the vision to serve the technology. So I think that's a really important one, as well as the thing you're selling is your ingenuity, not your skill set. So definitely there's arguments to be made. You're selling your skill set, but I think selling your ability to be your own body, your own mind, and your own artist is the most important part of being in this field. So maintaining these 2 principles for me is pretty guiding. And then the very last slide, I think, is just some more pictures. Oh no, I'm sorry. It's actually, I made like a future slide. Doesn't want to jump. Oh yeah, Sam read it. Yeah, so I was just bringing up like topics that they kind of hit on that are kind of futuristic in the show, as well as just in our daily lives. So these are just some of those topics, and we kind of just hit on the commercial versus independent approach. You know, it's very different style of thinking and logic when you're thinking how to make something with yourself and your friends, versus when you have teams of people that are counting on details that have to be factually, provable. So knowing what your limitations are on your project, I think is a really important first step, because if you know you're going to have a ton of people to hand stuff off to, you better be on top of your organization and tracking, so that you can yourself be the master of all the information, rather than being beholden to other people's updates and fixes and changes and problems. But that probably would have been good for Jacob too. But just the last 3 topics here about like talking commercial and indie, delivery, and then finishing in digital intermediate are all topics that we just kind of covered on this. But I think if you're looking to learn more about this beyond the documentary, I would look into these processes and to see how they kind of manifest in the post world, and how you yourself could start working on these kind of stuff. And I think the last slide is blank, so you can probably skip it. But yeah, that's about it. If you have any questions, pictures, and then that. But yeah, that's it. Highly recommend the documentary if you like stuff.
Thanks, Nico. Thanks, Sam. Awesome.
You bet.
Happy to share.
Cool.
Want to stop sharing soon?
Yeah, I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
really know how. I made the bar go away, but I don't know how to get it back.
I think maybe try hovering.
I'm
Oh,
hovering.
you got it.
Oh, wait.
maybe
Shana got it.
I forced it.
Thank you, Shana. Yes, it's not working.
Well, thank you guys so much for that. Again, if anyone wants to give me their Disney Plus login.
There are other ways, Shana. Just like if you want the despecialized original
VHS?
trilogy, there are ways of getting those.
Yeah, I have some text
Give it like
files
2
that-
years. We'll probably be on DVD by then.
I can send you some text files that might have an MOV extension.
Yeah, right.
Oh, fun fact. I did learn that Lawrence Kasdan, who was the director of this, he has the Laserdisc copies.
Nice. Yeah.
Is that like a thing? Like there's always one Laserdisc copy?
That's coveted. The Laserdisc original trilogy. Yeah, it's expensive.
Oh, sorry. I thought Sam was referring to just like a general Laserdisc we make for every project. I was like, is that thing we do?
No.
It's like we just get
That'd
out
be baller.
Laserdiscs. Like,
That's
here's
how you
your Laserdisc
archive.
back. Yeah,
he has
that's cool, but
the original trilogy.
yeah. Gotcha. That makes sense.
Cool.
Much more
I'm gonna-
coveted.
I'm gonna stop recording. So thank you guys so much. And
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in, y'all.